For 15 years, a lumberyard dumped its scraps over his grandfather's fence. What he discovered there wasn't just discarded wood, it was a final message, a hidden inheritance, and the beginning of a life he never thought he could have. If you've ever felt like you were starting from nothing, or if you believe in second chances, maybe hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. The air in the office was the same temperature as my skin, which is a strange and unsettling feeling. It was the kind of air that's been recycled so many times it's forgotten what wind feels like. The room was beige. The desk was beige. The face of the woman across from me, Mrs. Albright, had a sort of beige, tired kindness to it. It was my 18th birthday. In the system, that's not a day for cake and celebration. It's a day for paperwork. An expiration date. I was expiring from the care of the state of Oregon. 2 years in this group home, 6 years in the system overall, ever since my grandfather passed and the world fell out from under me. 2 years of beige rooms and scheduled meals and learning how to make myself small and quiet. Learning how to be a file in a cabinet, not a problem on a desk. And now, the file was being closed. Mrs. Albright slid a thick manila envelope across the laminate desktop. It made a soft, final sound. "Leo, this is it," she said, her voice gentle but firm, a tone she'd perfected over thousands of similar conversations. "Inside you'll find your final paperwork, a check for the $247 in your state account, and this." She tapped a smaller, crisper envelope that was sitting on top of the big one. It looked old. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, with a lawyer's letterhead embossed at the top. "This came for you about a week ago. We're instructed to give it to you on your 18th birthday, no sooner." I stared at the envelope. My name was typed on it. Leo Sterling. Below it, an address I hadn't seen in a very long time. The address of my grandfather's house. I hadn't been there since I was 11. After he died, they took me away, and the house just disappeared from my life. A place that was once the entire world became a ghost, a memory I wasn't sure was real. "What is it?" I asked, my own voice sounding rusty in the quiet room. "It's from a law firm," she said, stating the obvious. "They've been managing your grandfather's estate, or what's left of it." There was a hint of pity in her eyes, the kind I'd learned to hate. The kind that said, "Poor kid, another one with nothing and nowhere to go." She thought the house was long gone, sold to pay off debts. Everyone did. I thought so too. I reached out and took the envelope. The paper felt heavy, important. It felt like a stone dropping into the still, quiet pool of my life. "There's also a key," she added, pulling a single, tarnished brass key from her desk drawer. It was an old skeleton key, the kind you see in movies. It felt cold and solid in my palm. "It's for the property." I just looked at her. The property, not the house, a careful legal word. "I thought it was sold." "Apparently not," she said with a slight shrug. "The lawyer's letter will explain everything, I'm sure. There's also a one-way bus ticket in there, to Klatskanai. It leaves tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. She stood up, a signal that our time was over. My slot was up. There was another kid waiting, another file to be closed. "Leo," she said, and for a second, the beige professional mask slipped. "Good luck. You're a good kid. You've been through a lot. Don't let it define you." It was a nice thing to say. It was what you were supposed to say. I nodded, mumbled a thank you. I couldn't meet her eyes. I just clutched the envelopes and the key. My entire past and my entire future. All in my hands. A few $100s, a bus ticket to a town I barely remembered, and a key to a house that probably shouldn't exist. I walked out of the office, down the hallway that smelled of bleach and quiet desperation, and out the front door. The Portland air was cool and damp, and for the first time in 6 years, there was no one to tell me when to come back inside. I was free, and I had never felt so completely and utterly lost. I spent my last night in a cheap motel near the bus station, the $200 check cashed, and the small stack of bills feeling thin and inadequate in my pocket. I didn't sleep. I just sat on the edge of the stiff bed and stared at the lawyer's envelope. The room smelled of stale smoke and despair, a place for endings and desperate beginnings. It felt appropriate. For hours, I just held it. The fear of what was inside was worse than any reality, I figured. Bad news was a language I understood. It was hope that was terrifying. Around 3 a.m., with the neon sign outside buzzing and casting red shadows on the wall, I finally opened it. My hands were shaking. The letter was from a Mr. Alistair Davies, attorney at law. The language was dense, formal. It spoke of probate and trusts and property taxes. I had to read each sentence 3 or 4 times for it to make sense. But the core of it was this. My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, had set up a trust before he died. It was a small one, just enough to pay the property taxes on the house and the half-acre of land it sat on. For exactly 7 years. The trust was set to expire 1 week after my 18th birthday, which meant I had about 2 weeks from the day I was reading the letter. 2 weeks before the county would seize the property for back taxes. The letter went on to state that Mr. Davies had been contacted by a corporate entity, a development firm, with an interest in purchasing the property. They were prepared to make a cash offer. An offer, Mr. Davies noted, that would be substantial and would, after settling the tax debt, leave me with a significant sum of money. He advised me to travel to the property, assess its condition, and then contact him to discuss the offer. He believed it was in my best interest to sell. Of course he did. It was the sensible thing to do. Take the money, get an apartment, start a life. A clean break. But it didn't feel clean. It felt like selling a memory. Selling the last piece of my grandfather I had left. I remembered him in flashes. A big man with hands as rough as bark, smelling of sawdust and coffee. He was a carpenter, a cabinet maker. Not a fancy one. He made sturdy, honest things. He taught me how to hold a hammer, how to tell oak from pine by the smell. I remembered the low rumble of his voice when he'd read to me. I remembered the feeling of safety in that small house, a feeling I hadn't known since. And I remembered his silence in the last year of his life, the way he'd sit at the kitchen table, staring out the window, looking tired. I was too young to understand the weight he was carrying. Now it seemed that weight was being passed to me. I unfolded the bus ticket, Portland to Klatskanai, a 2-hour ride that felt like a journey to another planet. I looked at the key again. It wasn't just a key to a house. It was a key to a past I barely understood and a future I couldn't imagine. Selling it felt like giving up before I even started. It felt like what everyone expected me to do. The kid from the system, taking the easy money. But something stubborn and deep inside me, a part of me that sounded a little like my grandfather's quiet resolve, whispered no. Not yet. First, I had to go see it. I had to stand on that patch of ground and see what was left. I had to know what I was being asked to sell. It wasn't just a property. It was home. Or it had been, once. I had to know if any part of that home was still there. I lay back on the bed, the letter on my chest, the key clutched in my hand. The red light from the motel sign pulsed on the ceiling. For the first time, a feeling other than numb dread started to creep in. It was small and fragile, but it was there. A flicker of something that might have been hope, or maybe just curiosity. I would go. I would see. And then I would decide. The bus groaned out of the Portland station right at dawn, hissing its air brakes like a tired beast. I had a window seat, the glass cool against my forehead. The city was still asleep, a landscape of gray concrete and sleeping steel under a pale, misty sky. I watched the familiar streets of my institutional life slide by, the government buildings, the chain-link fences, the bus stops where I'd waited in the rain. I felt nothing watching them go. They weren't my home. They were just the places I had existed. As we hit the highway, The city began to fray at the edges. Warehouses gave way to strip malls, then to suburbs with identical houses, and finally, to green. The Oregon I barely knew began to unfold outside my window. Tall stands of Douglas fir, their tops lost in the low-hanging clouds. Green hills that rolled on forever. The air inside the bus was stale, a mix of vinyl and disinfectant, but I imagined I could smell the wet earth and the pines. I kept my hand in my pocket, wrapped around the brass key. It was a strange anchor in a world that was tilting. My memories of my grandfather's house were dreamlike, fragmented. I remembered a vegetable garden in the back, the taste of sun-warmed tomatoes. I remembered a wood stove in the living room that ticked as it cooled down at night. I remembered the sound of his tools from the barn he used as a workshop, the scrape of a hand plane, the buzz of a saw. They were sensory memories, feelings more than pictures. I couldn't remember the color of the curtains or the layout of the rooms, but I remembered the feeling of being safe. I remembered the feeling of belonging somewhere. The bus made a stop in a small town called Scappoose. A woman with a kind, wrinkled face got on and sat in the seat across the aisle from me. She smiled a little, and I gave a tight, practiced nod in return. Don't engage. Don't be a problem. The rules of the group home were burned into my brain, but she didn't try to talk. She just looked out her own window, her hands resting in her lap. We drove on. The landscape grew wilder, the houses fewer and farther between. We followed the curve of the Columbia River, a vast expanse of gray water moving silently toward the sea. Barges moved like slugs on its surface. The scale of it was humbling. It made my own problems feel small, temporary. I thought about the development company, the substantial offer. I could picture the men in suits, looking at a map, seeing my grandfather's half-acre not as a home, but as a parcel. A problem to be cleared, an asset to be acquired. The anger I felt was cold and quiet. It was the same anger I'd felt sitting in family court, watching adults decide my fate without once asking me what I wanted. It was the anger of being powerless. But I wasn't a kid anymore. The key in my pocket was proof of that. The decision was mine. The bus finally pulled into Klatskanai. It wasn't so much a station as a covered bench in front of the town's only grocery store. I was the only one who got off. The bus hissed and pulled away, leaving me in a sudden, profound silence. The air here was different. It smelled of river water and damp soil and wood smoke. The town was a small cluster of old buildings huddled near the highway. It looked like a place that time had mostly forgotten. According to the map on my phone, the house was about a mile's walk from the town center. I shouldered my backpack, which held everything I owned. 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and the manila envelope. I started walking. The pavement gave way to a gravel shoulder. The houses I passed were modest, with well-tended gardens and pickup trucks in the driveways. People were living their lives here. Quiet lives. The kind of life that had been stolen from me. The address was on a rural route, a turnoff from the main road. The name on the street sign was Furlock Lane. I remembered that name. My heart started beating faster. It was real. I was almost there. And then I saw it. At the end of the lane, where the gravel petered out into dirt, a small, single-story house with a sagging front porch, half hidden behind overgrown blackberry bushes. And behind it, something else. A mountain. A literal mountain of something brown and gray and jagged, towering over the back of the property. It was bigger than the house itself. It was a monument to neglect. My first thought was that a landfill had erupted. It took me a long moment to understand what I was looking at. It was wood. A gigantic, chaotic pile of wood scraps. Beams, planks, boards, offcuts, plywood sheets, all tangled together in a heap that stretched the entire length of the back fence line. It was the ugliest, most desolate thing I had ever seen. My grandfather's home. My inheritance. It was a dump. The gate, or what was left of it, was almost swallowed by the blackberry vines. I had to force it open with my shoulder, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. The path to the front door was a ghost, just a faint depression in a sea of weeds. The house looked even worse up close. The paint was peeling in long strips, revealing weathered gray wood beneath. A few shingles were missing from the roof. One of the front windows was cracked. It looked abandoned, forgotten. For a moment, I considered turning around, walking back to town, finding the first bus out, and calling the lawyer to say, "Sell it." This wasn't a home. It was a ruin. But I had walked all this way. I had the key. I put it in the lock. It was stiff, and I had to jiggle it, but then I felt the old tumblers give way with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The sound echoed in the silence. I pushed the door open. The air that rolled out was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time. Dust motes danced like tiny ghosts in the single beam of light slanting through the dirty window. The living room was mostly empty. A threadbare armchair sat facing a cold, dark wood stove. A small, rickety bookshelf stood against one wall, empty. Everything else was gone. Sold, probably. Or taken. I walked through the small house, my footsteps loud on the wooden floors. The kitchen was a study in decay. A faint, sour smell lingered. The linoleum was peeling up at the corners. In the bedroom, there was just a bare mattress on a simple metal frame, stained with age. This was where he had slept. This was where he had died. The grief I had kept locked away for 6 years started to press up against my ribs. It was a physical pain. I had cried when they told me he was gone, but it was the confused, helpless crying of a child. This was different. This was the grief of an adult understanding the true shape of his loss. I saw the smallness of this life, the poverty he must have lived in at the end. I felt a fresh wave of anger, this time at him. Why didn't you get help? Why did you let everything fall apart? Why did you leave me? I went back out the front door, needing air. I walked around the side of the house, pushing through waist-high grass. And then I faced the pile. The mountain of wood. It started at the back fence and sloped down towards the house, covering nearly a quarter of the half-acre lot. The fence itself was a sturdy-looking chain link, at least 10 feet high. On the other side of it was a sprawling industrial lot. A lumber yard. Piles of fresh logs, stacks of cut lumber, forklifts moving back and forth. The source of the mountain. For 15 years, the sign at the front of the yard must have said, "That's what the locals would know." They just dumped their scraps over the old man's fence. And he never did a thing about it. I walked closer. It wasn't just scraps. There were long, beautiful pieces of hardwood mixed in with splintered 2x4s. I saw the deep red of cherry, the creamy white of maple, the rich brown of walnut. There were gnarled burls, offcuts from massive beams, sheets of expensive-looking veneer. It was all just thrown there, a jumble of waste and treasure, a monument to carelessness. They hadn't just been dumping trash, they had been throwing away gold. Why? Why would my grandfather let them do this? He was a carpenter. He loved wood. This should have been an insult, a daily desecration of his property and his craft. Yet he let it happen. For years. I stood there, at the foot of this wooden mountain, feeling a profound and unsettling confusion. Nothing made sense. The neglected house, the trust that was about to run out, the lawyer pushing me to sell, and this bizarre inheritance of garbage. I felt overwhelmed, small. The weight of it all pressed down on me. I slid down to the ground, my back against the cold foundation of the house, and I finally let myself break. I cried. I cried for the boy who lost his grandfather. I cried for the young man who had no idea what to do. I cried for the house that was dying, and for the man who had let it happen. And as I sat there, sobbing in the tall grass, my eyes caught something. Tucked under the eaves of the back porch, Almost completely hidden by a tangle of ivy was a small, metal box. A heavy-duty toolbox, rusted but solid. It didn't look like it belonged there. It looked like it had been hidden. My tears stopped. A new feeling, sharp and focused, cut through the grief. I crawled over to the porch and pulled at the ivy. The vines were thick, woody. They clung to the box. I had to tear them away, my hands getting scratched and dirty. Finally, I worked the box free. It was heavy, padlocked. Of course it was. I stood up, holding it, and scanned the area. My eyes landed on a small, dilapidated shed near the back of the property, its door hanging off one hinge. The workshop. Or what was left of it. Inside, it was chaos. Tools were rusted. Surfaces were covered in a thick blanket of dust and cobwebs. But leaning against one wall was a crowbar. It felt solid in my hand. I carried it back to the porch, wedged the tip into the padlock's hasp, and put all my weight on it. The metal groaned, resisted, and then with a sharp crack, the lock snapped. My heart was pounding. I lifted the heavy lid of the box. Inside, the air was dry and still. On the very top was a stack of photographs, bound with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. I lifted them out carefully. It was me and him. Pictures I'd never seen before. Me as a little kid, sitting on his shoulders. Me with a hammer in my hand, concentrating fiercely on hitting a nail. Him, smiling a rare, genuine smile, his arm around me. Beneath the photos was a thick bundle of cash. $100 bills. I counted it. $10,000. A fortune. Enough to get an apartment, a car. Enough to disappear and start over. My breath caught in my throat. He had left this for me. This whole time, while I was in the system, feeling like I had nothing and no one, this was here. Waiting. And beneath the cash, there was a letter. A single, folded sheet of heavy paper, just like the lawyer's. It was his handwriting. I knew it instantly. It was big and blocky, the writing of a man who worked with his hands. My name was on the front. Leo. I sat on the edge of the porch, the box opened beside me, and unfolded the letter. My hands were trembling so much I could barely read the words. My dear Leo, it began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you are a man. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for all the time we lost. I hope the years have been as kind to you as they can be. I know it wasn't easy. There is much I need to explain, and not much time or space to do it. First, the house. I know how it must look. I let it go. I had to. When I got sick, I knew I didn't have long. And I knew they would take you. I couldn't bear the thought of them selling this place, our home, to pay for my care or for your keep. So I made a plan. A difficult one. I set up the trust to pay the taxes, just long enough to keep the county away until you were old enough to decide for yourself. I made the house look worthless. I made myself look worthless. A sad old man in a falling down house. No one looks twice at a sad old man. No one sees value in what he leaves behind. I had to stop reading. The words blurred through my tears. He hadn't abandoned the house. He had protected it. For me. I took a deep, shaky breath and continued reading. Now for the wood. That ugly mountain in the back. I can imagine what you thought when you saw it. I know it looks like a junk pile. But it's not, Leo. It's a gift. About 15 years ago, that lumberyard was bought by a big corporation. They got sloppy. They started throwing away good wood, expensive wood. offcuts, pieces with a knot or a strange grain. To them, it was waste. It cost them more to sort it than to dump it. I went to them once to complain. And the manager, a man in a cheap suit, he laughed at me. He said, "Old man, what are you going to do about it? Sue us." He told me to be grateful for the free firewood. So I did nothing. I let them keep piling it up. And I watched. I watched them throw away oak and cherry and walnut and maple. Wood that I would have given anything for when I was a young man. It's all there, Leo. A treasure chest disguised as a trash heap. I couldn't move it. I was too sick by then. But I could let it grow. For you. The letter ended with one final paragraph. There is $10,000 in this box. It's everything I had left. It is yours. You can take it, walk away, and never look back. No one would blame you. Or you can stay. You can use the money to pay the back taxes, to buy some tools, to fix the house. You can use the wood. You can build something. It is your choice. Whatever you do, know that I loved you. Know that every day without you was a day I was working to give you this one choice. Your grandfather, Arthur. I sat there for a long time, the letter in my lap, the cool afternoon air on my face. The whole world had been turned upside down. The story I had told myself for 6 years, the story of abandonment, of being left with nothing. It was all wrong. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't given up. He had fought for me in the only way he could. He had made a sacrifice so quiet and so deep that no one had noticed. He had turned neglect into a strategy. He had weaponized his own poverty to protect my future. He had given me a choice. Not a legacy, not an inheritance of money, but a choice. Walk away with a little, or stay and build something from nothing. I looked from the money in the box to the mountain of wood. One was an ending, the other was a beginning. A hard, difficult, splinter-filled beginning. I looked at the picture of him, smiling, his arm around a small boy who had no idea how much he was loved. And I knew what I had to do. That night, I didn't sleep in the house. I couldn't. The emptiness of it was too loud. I took a blanket from the box, he'd packed that too, and I slept on the floor of the back porch, the rusted toolbox next to me. The air grew cold, but it was a clean, real cold, not the dead air of an institution. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up again, my heart pounding, convinced it was all a dream. Then my hand would find the rough paper of the letter in my pocket, and I would know it was real. I was home. The next morning, I woke up with the sunrise. The light hit the top of the woodpile, making the different colors and textures stand out. It didn't look like a trash heap anymore. It looked like a quarry. It looked like potential. I spent the morning making a list. First, survival. I walked into town, my posture different, my stride longer. I wasn't a lost kid anymore. I was a man with a purpose. I went to the grocery store and bought food, bread, peanut butter, coffee, things that would last. The cashier, a teenage girl, gave me a curious look. I was a new face. I paid with a crisp $100 bill from the box. It felt like a declaration. Then I went to the county tax office, a small brick building next to the library. A woman with glasses perched on her nose looked up my property. Her expression was one of polite boredom until she saw the amount owing. "It's due for seizure in 9 days," she said, her tone flat. "The amount due is $6,821.54. I counted out $6,900 bills onto the counter. Her eyebrows shot up. She looked at the cash, then at me, a skinny kid in a worn-out hoodie. I could see the questions in her eyes. I just stared back, my expression calm. "I want a receipt," I said. She processed the payment, her movements slow and deliberate. She stamped the paperwork with a heavy, final-sounding thud. "The property is in your name, Mr. Sterling. The title is clear." Mr. Sterling. No one had ever called me that before. I walked out of that office feeling 10 feet tall. The biggest weight was gone. The house was mine. Truly mine. Now, if you've made it this far into my story, I want to pause for a second. Because what I did next was the hardest part. It was the moment I had to choose to believe in a future I couldn't see yet. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you had to turn your back on the easy way out and choose the difficult path because something deep inside you knew it was the right one. Maybe someone left you something, not money, but a responsibility, a promise, a piece of themselves. And you had to decide if you were strong enough to carry it. If you have, I'd love to read about it in the comments. These stories we share, they're not just stories, they're proof that we can rebuild. That what looks like an ending can be a beginning. Okay, back to the story. I had about $3,000 left. It wasn't much. Not when I needed to fix a house and buy tools. But my grandfather's letter had said to use the wood. The solution was right in front of me. I just had to be willing to do the work. I spent the rest of that day at the foot of the mountain. I wasn't just looking anymore. I was studying. I started to pull at the edges of the pile. It was slow, difficult work. The pieces were tangled, heavy. Splinters dug into my hands. But as I pulled pieces free, I started to see what he meant. A thick slab of spalted maple, its surface a beautiful chaos of black lines. A clear, straight board of cherry, 8 feet long. A piece of quarter-sawn oak that must have cost a fortune. It was like a geological survey, digging through layers of time. The newest scraps were on top, cheap pine, splintered plywood. But the deeper I dug, the older and better the wood became. It was a history of their wastefulness. I felt a grim satisfaction with every good piece I salvaged. They had thrown this away, and I was going to make it into something beautiful. That night, I made my first fire in the wood stove, using the worthless scraps for fuel. I sat in the old armchair, the one my grandfather had left, and watched the flames. The house was still cold and empty, but for the first time, it felt like it was mine. It was a start. The choice was made. The work was just beginning. The next few weeks were a blur of labor unlike any I had ever known. My days started before sunrise and ended long after sunset. My body ached in ways I didn't know were possible. My hands, soft from years of institutional life, were quickly covered in blisters that broke, bled, and eventually hardened into calluses. My uniform was a pair of cheap work gloves, a hoodie, and a layer of sawdust. My entire world shrank to that half-acre of land. My first task was sorting. I couldn't just start building. I had to know what I had. I cleared a space near the workshop and began to dismantle the mountain, one piece at a time. It was a dangerous, frustrating process. Pieces would shift unexpectedly. I'd spend an hour trying to free one good board, only to have it be cracked or rotten on the underside. But for every 10 pieces of junk, I'd find one treasure. I started making separate piles. Oak over here, maple over there. A pile for the exotic offcuts, walnut, cherry, even a few pieces of what looked like teak. A huge pile of usable, but less glamorous, pine and fir. And a massive, growing pile of true scrap, which became my fuel for the wood stove. Each piece I saved felt like a small victory, a tiny act of reclamation. I was literally pulling value out of a garbage heap. During this time, I saw the lumberyard trucks. They'd come to the back fence, and with a loud, indifferent roar, a forklift would dump another load of offcuts onto the pile. The first time it happened, I just stood there and watched, my heart pounding with a strange mix of anger and gratitude. The driver saw me. He paused for a second, a silhouette in his high cab, then just shook his head and drove off. To him, I was just some squatter, a kid playing in a junk pile. He had no idea he was delivering my inventory. The quiet humor of it wasn't lost on me. They were, without knowing it, funding their own competition. A very, very small competition, but still. After about a week of sorting, I turned my attention to the workshop. It was a disaster. The roof leaked, the dirt floor was damp, and most of the tools were rusted beyond saving. But the structure was solid. My grandfather had built it to last. I used some of the less precious lumber I'd salvaged, long, straight 2x6s, to patch the roof. I found old coffee cans full of nails, many of them rusted, but some were still good. I spent 2 days just cleaning, sweeping out a decade of grime and decay. I found an old workbench my grandfather had built. It was massive, made from a single slab of maple, its surface covered in the scars of 1,000 projects. I ran my hand over it, feeling the cuts and divots. It was like a map of his working life. This was where he had stood. This was where he had created things. I felt his presence in that workshop more than anywhere else. I took $200 of my remaining money and walked to the town's only hardware store. It was the kind of place that smelled of metal and oil, where the owner knew every item on every shelf. He was an old man named Gus, with a skeptical look and grease under his fingernails. "Need some tools," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He looked me up and down. "For what?" "Building furniture," I said. His skepticism deepened. "With what wood?" "I have some," I said, not elaborating. I bought the essentials: a good handsaw, a set of chisels, a sharpening stone, a hand plane. I couldn't afford power tools yet. Everything would have to be done by hand, the way my grandfather had probably started. Gus watched me pick out the tools. He seemed to approve of my choices. "You know how to use these?" he asked, his voice gruff. "My grandfather taught me. A little," I said. "Arthur Sterling." Gus's expression softened instantly. "Arthur. Hell of a carpenter. Haven't seen him in, well, a long time. Stubborn man. Good man." He looked at the tools in my hands. "Arthur's grandson, huh? Well, you make sure you keep those chisels sharp. A dull tool is more dangerous than a sharp one." It was the first real conversation I'd had since arriving. The first sign that I wasn't just an anonymous face. I was Arthur's grandson. That meant something here. I walked back to the property, the new tools heavy in my bag. The workshop was clean. The wood was sorted. I had everything I needed to begin. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface. But for the first time, it was balanced by a sense of purpose. I was ready to build. One afternoon, about a month after I'd arrived, a sleek, dark gray sedan pulled up to the gate. It looked completely out of place against the backdrop of weeds and rust. A man in a tailored suit got out. He was in his late 50s, with silvering hair and a calm, composed face. He looked at the house, at the now organized piles of lumber, and at me, standing there covered in sawdust. He didn't look shocked or disgusted, just observant. He walked toward me, extending a hand. "Leo Sterling? I'm Alistair Davies." The lawyer. I had almost forgotten about him. I wiped my gritty hand on my jeans before shaking his. His grip was firm, dry. "I was in the area," he said, though we both knew that was a lie. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you were settling in, and to discuss the offer from Westline Development." He gestured vaguely toward the lumberyard. "They own that now. They're planning a major expansion. Your property is strategic." I just nodded, waiting. "They're offering $450,000, Leo," he said, his voice even. "Cash. They'll handle the closing costs. After my fees, you'd walk away with well over $400,000. You could go to college, buy a condo in the city, never have to worry about money for a long, long time." He said it so reasonably. It was the sensible path, the logical choice. A month ago, hearing that number would have been like a lightning strike. It would have been the answer to every problem I had. But a month ago, I hadn't read my grandfather's letter. I hadn't spent hundreds of hours with my hands on his legacy. "I'm not selling," I said. The words came out quieter than I expected, but they were firm. Davies didn't look surprised. He looked intrigued. "May I ask why?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious, not judgmental. "This place," he gestured to the rundown house, "it requires a tremendous amount of work. The money would give you a fresh start, a much easier start." "Easier isn't always better," I said, echoing a phrase my grandfather used to use. I led him to the workshop. It was still rough, but it was organized. The workbench was clean. My new tools were arranged neatly on a rack I'd built. A few pieces of the best wood were stacked against a wall, waiting. He looked around, taking it all in. "You're planning on following in his footsteps then," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm planning on finishing what he started," I corrected him gently. Mr. Davies was silent for a moment. He ran his hand along the edge of the maple workbench, the same way I had. "Arthur was a client of mine for 20 years, he said softly. "He was a proud, difficult man. When he came to me with his plan for the trust, I advised him against it. I told him to sell then, to use the money for his treatment, to make his last years comfortable. He looked at me. He refused. He said comfort wasn't the point. He said he was investing in a future he wouldn't get to see. I thought he was a fool, a stubborn old man clinging to a piece of dirt. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, locked metal box. This one more like a deed box. It was cleaner, less weathered than the one I'd found. He left this with me. My instructions were to give it to you only if you refused the first offer from Westline. He made me promise. He handed me the box and a small key. He said, if the boy takes the money, he doesn't need this. But if he chooses the work, if he chooses the wood, then he'll need the maps. My hands shook as I took the box. Maps? I unlocked it and lifted the lid. Inside, there were no maps. Not of land, anyway. There were journals. 6 of them, filled with my grandfather's blocky handwriting. And sketches, page after page of them. Designs for chairs, tables, cabinets, bookshelves. Each one was detailed, with measurements and notes on the type of wood to use. There were notes on joinery, on finishing techniques. It was a complete curriculum in his craft. It was his life's work distilled onto paper. And tucked into the front of the first journal was another letter. Leo, it read, if you are reading this, it means you chose the wood. It means you are your father's son, and my grandson, through and through. I am prouder than you can imagine. The money I left you was a test, the easy way out. But the easy way builds nothing. I knew they would come for this land. I knew it would become valuable. What they don't know is that the real value isn't in the dirt. It's in what's been piled on top of it. These are my designs. Some are things I built. Some are things I only dreamed of building. They are yours now. Don't just build furniture, son. Build a life. They can't take that away from you. I looked up at Mr. Davies. His eyes were shining. For 7 years, I thought I was managing the affairs of a fool, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was wrong. I was managing the first phase of a brilliant, stubborn, beautiful plan. He cleared his throat. The offer from Westline stands. In fact, they'll probably increase it. But my legal advice has changed. My advice now is to get to work, Mr. Sterling. He shook my head again, a new respect in his grip. If you need anything, incorporation paperwork, business advice, anything, you call me. My services are at your disposal, no charge. Consider it my penance for underestimating your grandfather. He walked back to his car, leaving me standing there in the sawdust, holding the true inheritance. It wasn't the land or the house or even the wood. It was the knowledge, the plan, the belief of a man who had looked into the future and placed his faith not in money, but in me. The journals changed everything. They weren't just designs, they were a conversation across time. My grandfather's notes were practical, direct, but they were also filled with his voice. "When you join Cherry, watch the grain," one note read. "It will tell you which way it wants to go. Don't fight it." Another said, "The beauty of spalted maple is its imperfection. Don't try to make it perfect, just make it honest." I spent my evenings by the light of a single bulb I'd rigged up in the workshop, poring over the sketches. I wasn't just learning how to build furniture, I was learning how he thought. I was getting to know the man again, not as a fading memory of a child, but as a craftsman, a thinker, an artist. I chose my first project. It was one of the simplest designs in the journals, a small end table. The notes specified it should be made from a single, wide board of oak with a strong, straight grain. I remembered a piece I had pulled from the pile, a thick plank of quarter-sawn white oak. I had almost discarded it because of a dark, ugly stain on one end. But I had saved it. I spent a full day just preparing that board. I didn't have a power jointer or planer. I had the hand plane I'd bought from Gus. It was slow, meditative work. Scrape, check for square. Scrape, check for flatness. The shavings curled up from the plane, smelling sweet and clean. As I worked, the rough, weathered surface of the board gave way to the clean, bright wood underneath. The grain was beautiful, like rays of light frozen in the wood. The work was physically demanding, but my mind was quiet. For the first time in my life, there was no room for anxiety or fear. There was only the wood, the tool, and the line I was trying to follow. When I cut the pieces for the legs and the apron, I used the handsaw. My first cuts were wobbly, uncertain, but I remembered Gus's advice and a note in the journal. "Let the saw do the work, your hand is just a guide." I learned to listen to the sound of the saw, to feel the rhythm of the cut. The joinery was the hardest part. The design called for mortise and tenon joints, a classic technique that required precise, square holes, mortises, and perfectly fitted tongues, tenons. My first attempts were clumsy. The chisels felt awkward in my hands. I made mistakes. I cut one tenon too thin and had to start over. But I didn't get discouraged. I just went back to the journals, studied the diagrams, and tried again. I was building more than a table. I was building a skill. I was building patience. After a week of work, the table was assembled. It was simple, sturdy, and honest. It wasn't perfect. If you looked closely, you could see the imperfections in my joinery, the slight unevenness of the planed surface. But it was solid. It was real. I had made it. I spent another 2 days finishing it, sanding it smooth by hand, working my way through finer and finer grits of sandpaper until the wood felt like silk. Then I applied the finish, a simple oil and wax blend my grandfather had detailed in his notes. As the oil hit the wood, the grain exploded with depth and color. It came alive. I stood back and looked at it, a small, simple oak table. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I had taken a piece of discarded trash, a piece of wood that was destined to rot, and with my own 2 hands, I had turned it into this. I had taken his knowledge and made it my own. I carried the table into the house and set it next to the old armchair. It was the first new thing in that house in over a decade. It was a beginning, a promise fulfilled. That night, I didn't feel like an orphan or a ward of the state. I felt like a carpenter. I felt like Arthur Sterling's grandson. The weight of his legacy no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a foundation. The first table was a turning point. It proved to me that I could do it, that my grandfather's faith in me wasn't misplaced. I kept building. I worked my way through the journals, starting with the simpler designs and gradually tackling more complex ones. I built a set of bookshelves from cherry, its reddish wood glowing in the workshop light. I built a small writing desk from a piece of walnut that had a beautiful, swirling grain. Each project taught me something new. Each piece was a little better than the last. My hands grew stronger, more confident. I learned to read the wood, to anticipate how it would behave. I started making small modifications to the designs, adding my own small touches. I felt like I was in conversation with him, adding my own verse to the song he had started. The money from the first box ran out. I was living on almost nothing. I ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches. But I wasn't scared. The fear had been replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. I knew I had a way forward. One day, the lumberyard truck driver stopped. He was a big guy named Frank, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He'd been watching me for months. "You're Arthur's grandkid, right?" he asked, leaning out of his cab. I nodded. "Figured," he said. "You work like he did. Quiet. Steady." He gestured with his thumb toward the load of scraps in his forklift. "Listen, my boss is an idiot. We throw away good stuff all the time. Sometimes, I can make sure the good stuff lands on the top of the pile. You know, for easy access." He winked. "Just keep an eye out." It was a small act of rebellion, of solidarity. Frank had known my grandfather. He respected the craft. From then on, the quality of the scrap improved dramatically. Sometimes I'd find a whole stack of maple boards, or a beautiful slab of fir, sitting right on top. It was another gift. Another piece of the quiet community that was slowly forming around me. I finished a coffee table made from a stunning piece of spalted maple. It was the most ambitious thing I'd built yet. The top was a single, wide slab, its chaotic lines looking like a painter's abstract canvas. I knew it was special. But I also knew I needed to sell it. I needed money for food, for electricity, for more tools. I took a picture of it with my cheap phone and, with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, posted it on a local online marketplace. I listed it for $500. I thought the price was crazy. I expected silence, or maybe a lowball offer. An hour later, my phone pinged. It was a woman who owned a small cafe in St. Helens, the next town over. "Is this still available?" she wrote. "It's beautiful. It would be perfect for my coffee shop." We arranged for her to come see it. She arrived the next day, a woman with bright, artistic energy. She walked into my workshop, her eyes wide. She looked at the table, at the other pieces I was working on, at the neat stacks of salvaged wood. "You made this? From that?" she asked, pointing toward the woodpile. I told her the story, the whole story. My grandfather, the lumberyard, the letters. She listened, her expression full of wonder. "This isn't just a table," she said, running her hand over the smooth maple. "This is a story. I'll take it." She paid me in cash, and as she and her husband loaded the table into their truck, she said, "You should make more. People will buy them. People want things that are real, things with a story." That $500 felt more valuable than the $10,000 in the box. I had earned it. I had created it from nothing. I went to the hardware store and bought my first power tool, a used table saw. Gus gave me a discount. "Arthur would be proud," he said, and that meant more to me than the money I'd saved. Things started to change. Word got around. The cafe owner told her customers about the table. Frank, the truck driver, told his buddies. Gus told his. People started stopping by. At first, they were just curious. They'd heard the story of the kid at the old Sterling place. They'd come to look at the woodpile, to peek into the workshop. Then, they started asking for things. "Could you build me a bookcase? My wife has been wanting a new dining table." I started taking commissions. I was working from my grandfather's designs, but I was also listening to what people wanted. I was building for my community. I hired Mr. Davies to file the paperwork to officially create Sterling Woodcraft. The name felt right. It was his, and it was mine. One day, a black SUV pulled up. Not a sleek sedan this time. A man in an expensive polo shirt and loafers got out. He was from Westline Development. He was here to make me a new offer. $750,000. he said, not even trying to be polite. That's our final offer. Take it or leave it. I didn't even hesitate. I just smiled. I'm not selling, I said. This is my shop. He looked at the half-finished house, the workshop, the piles of wood. He looked at me, covered in sawdust. He couldn't understand it. To him, it was just dirt. He couldn't see the value. He couldn't see the story. He just shook his head and drove away. I watched him go, and I felt a sense of peace. I had made my choice, and I was living it. I was building a life, one board at a time. It wasn't an easy life. It was a life of hard work, of long days. But it was mine. I had built it. And so, here we are. It's been 3 years since that day I first put the key in the lock. The house isn't a ruin anymore. I used the money from my first dozen sales to put on a new roof, to replace the windows, to paint the walls. I did the work myself on evenings and weekends. The inside is filled with furniture I built, each piece a chapter in my story. The old armchair still sits by the wood stove, but now it has the oak end table next to it. The workshop has expanded. I have more tools now, bought one by one as I could afford them. The mountain of wood is smaller, but more organized. It's not a junk pile, it's my lumber yard, my inventory, a constant reminder of where this all came from. Sterling Woodcraft is a real business. I have a backlog of orders that will keep me busy for the next year. I'm not getting rich, not by a long shot. But I pay my bills, I eat well, I sleep soundly in the house my grandfather saved for me. I'm not just surviving, I'm thriving. The community that started as a whisper has become a real part of my life. Frank still brings me special deliveries. Gus gives me advice on tools and life. The cafe owner, Sarah, became my first regular customer and a good friend. The people of this town don't see me as the lost kid from the system anymore. They see me as the Sterling boy, the carpenter, Arthur's grandson. I found more than a business here. I found a place to belong. Sometimes, when I'm working late in the shop, with the smell of sawdust in the air and the hum of a tool in my hand, I'll feel him. My grandfather. It's not a ghost, just a feeling. A sense of quiet approval. A presence in the grain of the wood, in the logic of the designs, in the sturdiness of the things I build. He didn't just leave me a pile of wood. He left me a path. He taught me that the most valuable things in life are often disguised as worthless. He taught me that inheritance isn't something you're given, it's something you build. He taught me that home isn't just a place, it's the work you put into it. This journey wasn't just about building furniture, it was about rebuilding a life. It was about taking the discarded scraps of my past and finding the treasure within them. It was about learning to be my own foundation. And that's a lesson I want to share with all of you. Maybe your story isn't about a pile of wood. Maybe it's about a failed business, a broken relationship, a past you're trying to overcome. We all have our scrap piles, the things we think are worthless, the things we want to hide or throw away. But I'm here to tell you that those piles often hold the very materials you need to build your future. The strength you gained, the lessons you learned, the resilience you discovered, it's all in there. You just have to be willing to do the work of sorting through it. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you a little bit of hope, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and join our community here. And in the comments, I want you to tell me, what's the scrap pile in your life? And what's the first beautiful thing you're going to build from it? I'll be reading every single one. Because your story matters. We're all just trying to build something that will last. Thank you for listening.